The wind was a living thing at Seacliff House, a howling beast that whipped the ocean into a cold, churning frenzy. It screamed past the grey stone walls, rattling the windows like a desperate prisoner trying to escape. I stood on the edge of the cliff, the fine spray from the furious waves misting my face and sticking to the woolen coat I had hastily pulled on. Down below, on the jagged rocks, a figure lay still. A flash of white silk, a cascade of dark hair, a stillness that was utterly unnatural. Lillian Thorne, celebrated star of the stage and screen, had fallen from the cliff walk. My stomach twisted into a cold knot. It was a place I had walked with her just yesterday, the sun a rare and welcome companion on our faces. She had laughed, a sound like chimes, and gestured to the vast, endless Pacific, promising that this wild, dramatic place was where she felt most at home. I had warned her then about the precarious nature of the path, its loose stones and sheer drop, but she had merely smiled, fearless and untouchable as ever. Now, she was a broken thing on the rocks below, and the sea spray was not the only thing blurring my vision. A car door slammed behind me, the sound muted by the roar of the wind. I didn't turn. I had no desire to speak with anyone, to offer condolences that felt like empty platitudes in the face of such a brutal reality. I had known Lillian for years, a friendship forged in the crucible of Hollywood's fickle heart. She was a woman of immense talent and even greater complexity. A life lived in the spotlight had not made her simple. It had made her a labyrinth of guarded secrets. The last time we spoke, just hours ago, her voice had been laced with a tension I hadn't heard before. We were on the phone, and she had been cryptic, hinting at a shadow that had settled over Seacliff House, something she couldn't name but felt in the very bones of the place. She'd promised to tell me more at dinner, a promise she could no longer keep. My jaw tightened. This wasn't an accident. Not Lillian. She was too careful, too sure-footed. The fall was too convenient, too dramatic. It was a final, tragic performance, and I was going to find the person who had written the script. Chapter 1. I turned from the cliff and headed back to the house, the cold gnawing at my bones. The mansion was a monstrosity of a place, all gabled roofs and narrow windows, designed to withstand the fury of the coast but not the fury of the people inside it. The front door was a heavy slab of dark wood, and when I pushed it open, the sudden silence was as jarring as a gunshot. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp wool and old wood, and a heavy, suffocating grief that was not my own. In the grand foyer, two figures stood motionless. Julian Vance, Lillian's fiancé, was a man in his late 30s with a charming, easy smile that was now gone, replaced by a pale, drawn mask. He was a painter of some repute, and it was his artistic vision that had led them to this house, to this dramatic, windswept coastline. He stood next to Lillian's younger sister, Genevieve, a woman with a severe expression and a bitterness that seemed to curdle the air around her. She was a playwright, and her words had a sharp, cutting edge that rivaled the clifftop winds. They both stared at the rain-streaked windows, their backs to me. Neither of them spoke, and the silence felt less like shared sorrow and more like a carefully constructed wall. "Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the stillness. He turned, his eyes unfocused. "Phryne," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "Lillian." He trailed off, gesturing vaguely towards the door. Genevieve didn't turn. She only shifted her weight, a subtle movement that held a universe of resentment. I knew their story. Genevieve had idolized her older sister, had lived her life in the shadow of Lillian's success. It had been a suffocating weight, a constant reminder of her own perceived failures. The bitterness was a physical thing, a thick, palpable tension that clung to her like a shroud. A new sound, the thud of heavy footsteps on the floorboards, drew my attention to the staircase. A woman was descending, her silhouette slender and straight. This was the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a woman I had seen only in passing. She was a silent, watchful presence, her movements as fluid and soundless as a ghost. She carried herself with an air of immense dignity, her face a serene mask that betrayed no emotion. She was a mystery in her own right, a woman who seemed to exist only in the periphery, serving a purpose that no one could quite define. "The police are on their way, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice soft and even. "I've lit the fire in the drawing room." Julian merely nodded, his eyes fixed on the window. Genevieve finally turned, her face a mask of furious, contained emotion. "I told her," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "I told her that cliff walk was too dangerous. But she never listened to me. She never listened to anyone." My gaze met hers. Her grief felt like rage, a furious, burning anger that had been simmering for a long time, only now boiling over. Her jealousy of Lillian was well known, a poison that had seeped into every corner of their relationship. I had seen it firsthand, the way Genevieve's face would tighten when someone praised Lillian's work, the way she would offer a backhanded compliment that was more insult than praise. The front door opened again, and a man in a dark trench coat stepped inside, shaking the rain from his hat. He was tall, with a rugged, worn face and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He was the local detective, a man with a reputation for being as unyielding as the coast itself. "Detective Miles Corbin," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He looked at me, his gaze sweeping over my fashionable coat and stylish shoes, a hint of disdain in his expression. "And you are?" "Miss Phryne Fisher," I replied, holding his gaze. "A friend of Miss Thorne's. I was a guest here for the weekend." He didn't seem to believe me. His eyes narrowed, and a line appeared between his brows. "The authorities will handle this, Miss Fisher. We have no need for civilian assistance." A small, wry smile touched my lips. "I assure you, Detective, I am more than a simple civilian. I believe Lillian's death was no accident. She was murdered." His expression didn't change, but a flicker of interest appeared in his eyes. He had the kind of face that kept its secrets well. "And what makes you so sure of that?" "A gut feeling," I said, my voice soft but firm. "And a lifetime of experience in noticing things others miss." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could feel the silent, tense opposition between us. He was a man of logic and procedure, a man who saw the world in black and white. I was a woman of intuition and instinct, a creature of the grey. He was handsome in a severe, no-nonsense way, his face a landscape of hard lines and shadows. I could feel the subtle attraction between us, a spark of electricity that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with a shared purpose. "Follow me to the drawing room, everyone," he finally said, his voice low and commanding. "I'll be taking your statements one by one. And you, Miss Fisher, can wait your turn. I have a feeling we have much to discuss." He turned and strode down the hall, and I followed, a cold, unwavering certainty settling in my bones. The game had begun. The murderer was in this house, hiding in plain sight, and I was going to unmask them. The silence of the house had a new meaning now. It was not just a lack of sound but a deliberate choice, a refusal to speak the truth. And I had a feeling the truth was going to be more painful than anyone could imagine. Chapter 2. Detective Corbin set his jaw, a muscle twitching in his cheek as he finished his interview with Julian Vance. The painter had been a study in performative grief. He'd wrung his hands, his eyes had been moist, but the sorrow felt thin, like a veil you could see right through. Julian spoke of Lillian in hushed, reverent tones, recalling their grand love story, their shared artistic sensibilities, and their plans for the future. It was a perfect portrait, meticulously painted, but I found myself looking at the negative space. The way his gaze kept straying to the antique clock on the mantelpiece, as though he was counting the minutes until this ordeal was over. "We were to be married in the spring," Julian had said, his voice cracking with just the right amount of emotion. "We were so happy here. This place was our sanctuary." Corbin scribbled a few notes on his pad, then turned to Genevieve, who sat in an armchair, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She had refused to sit on the sofa beside Julian. Her testimony was a sharp contrast to his. Where he was a landscape of soft edges, she was a jagged rock. Her words were clipped, her answers brief. When asked about her relationship with Lillian, she had simply said, "We were sisters. That's all you need to know." I watched as Corbin tried to pry more from her, to unearth the motive I could see simmering just below the surface of her skin, but she was a fortress of silent resentment. She deflected every question with a shrug or a pointed stare, her bitterness a shield against any prying. Her clothes were a simple, dark wool dress, a world away from the glamorous gowns Lillian had been known for. It was as though she had always been a ghost, haunting the life her sister lived. After she was dismissed, Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, was the last to be questioned. She was a woman of few words, and she answered Corbin's questions with the quiet precision of a clockmaker. She had been in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when she heard a cry followed by a sickening thud. She hadn't seen anything, hadn't heard a struggle. Just a single, solitary sound that had frozen her to the spot. Her lack of emotion was not like Julian's performance or Genevieve's bottled rage. It was a profound, eerie emptiness, as though her heart had been removed long ago. When she left, Corbin sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "Well, that was a bust," he muttered, closing his notebook. "One says it was an accident, the other can't be bothered to care, and the last one says nothing." "A bust?" I asked, raising a brow. "Detective, you have two people who were financially dependent on the victim, and a third who seems to be holding a secret that's heavier than the sea itself. And they all have flimsy alibis." He looked at me, a grudging respect dawning in his eyes. "You're a good observer, Miss Fisher. I'll give you that." He gestured to a chair. "Sit. Let's compare notes." I did, my coat still slightly damp from the rain. "The painting Julian spoke of, the one he was working on, where is it?" "It's in his studio." "Why?" "He said he was painting a portrait of Lillian at the time she fell. But she was a notoriously difficult subject, prone to fits of impatience. He'd have been working from a photograph, and that means he wasn't with her on the cliff walk. He was a professional. He would know better than to lie about a detail like that. He was trying to mislead you, to make his alibi sound more romantic and less calculated." Corbin's eyebrows rose slightly. "A good point. What about the sister?" "Genevieve has a motive as old as time itself, jealousy. She's a playwright who has lived her entire life in the shadow of a celebrated actress. The money she inherited from Lillian isn't the real prize. The real prize is the stage, now free of her sister's blinding light." "And the housekeeper?" he asked. "She is the one who saw nothing and knows everything. Her quietness is a mask, and I intend to find out what's underneath it." Just then, a uniformed officer knocked on the door and stuck his head in. "Detective Corbin, we found something. Miss Thorne's jewelry box. It's empty, and a few things from her bedroom are missing." My blood ran cold. This changed everything. This wasn't a crime of passion or inheritance. It was a crime with a cover-up. The killer was trying to make it look like a robbery, a detail to throw us off the scent. "What's missing?" I asked the officer. "We're making a list now, but it looks like a pearl necklace and a diamond bracelet. They're not the most expensive items she owned, but they were the most sentimental. Her engagement gifts from a previous suitor, a man she had been deeply in love with." A new twist. Not a robbery, but an attempt to frame a specific person, to throw suspicion on a forgotten flame. I turned to Corbin. "The list. I want to see it." While he went to the bedroom, I found Mrs. Gable in the kitchen, her hands methodically kneading dough on a floured board. The smell of fresh bread was at odds with the stench of death and deceit. "Mrs. Gable," I said quietly, "Lillian was happy here, was she not?" She stopped kneading and looked up, her gaze steady and unwavering. "She was content, Miss Fisher, but not happy." "Why not?" "She had a great secret. One she guarded fiercely. It's a heavy burden to carry, to love someone who cannot be yours." My mind raced. A secret lover. Her silence was the only confirmation I needed. A heavy burden that would not be Julian. Their love was very public. He wouldn't be a secret. She said nothing, but a subtle nod of her head confirmed my suspicion. Where did they meet? I asked, my voice low. She pointed a flour-dusted finger toward the rain-streaked window, to a distant, overgrown path that snaked away from the main house. Down there, she said, her voice a near whisper. A place away from all the cameras and all the people. I thanked her and went to find Corbin, who was just returning, a list in his hand. The pearls and bracelet aren't the only things missing, he said. A few architectural drawings are gone too. Plans for an old, unused outbuilding on the property. My mind clicked. The plans for a secluded cabin. His eyes widened in surprise. How did you know? A gut feeling, detective. Now, I have a feeling we both know where our next stop should be. I've been told there's a hidden cabin on the grounds, a place where secrets were kept. And I'm willing to bet a life was lived there, and a life was ended because of it. Corbin looked at me for a long moment, a slow smile spreading across his face. After you, Miss Fisher. Lead the way. We left the house together, the rain finally subsiding, replaced by a brooding stillness. The air was cold and heavy with the smell of wet earth and sea salt. We followed the overgrown path Mrs. Gable had pointed out, our footsteps crunching on the wet gravel. The path led us down, away from the grand, imposing house, and toward the tree line. The trees became denser, their branches intertwined overhead, and a small, forgotten cabin came into view. It was a rustic, unpainted structure, its windows dark and empty, as if no one had lived there in years. Yet, a faint wisp of smoke curled from its chimney, and the air around it held the faint, lingering scent of a fire that had only recently been put out. We both reached for the doorknob at the same time, our hands brushing against each other. The lock was simple, and Phryne had a toolkit with her, a simple lockpick, and a few moments later, the door swung open. The cabin was small, with a single room and a small kitchen. On the floor was a half-finished painting, not of Lillian, but of the very cliff from which she fell. And next to the painting was a set of cufflinks, inscribed with the initials, D.S. Dominic Shaw, Corbin said, his voice flat. A local architect. He hasn't been seen in days. The cabin was empty, but it was not lifeless. A half-empty glass of wine sat on a small wooden table. A single journal lay open on a rickety bed, its pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. It was not Lillian's. It was the handwriting of a man in love. A man who wrote of a perfect angel who would be mine one day. I picked up the journal, my heart pounding in my chest. The last entry was dated 2 nights ago. She told me she would leave him. She would be free. We were going to run away together. We were going to leave this place forever. Corbin's face was a mask of cold fury. He lied. Julian lied. Lillian was going to leave him for another man. This Dominic Shaw. A sudden, jarring thought slammed into my mind. The missing jewelry, the sentimental engagement gifts from a previous suitor. What if they weren't from a previous suitor at all? What if they were from her current one? What if they were from Dominic Shaw, and the killer, knowing this, took them to try to hide the truth and frame an old suitor? The painting, too, was a detail that pointed to a secret life. Julian claimed to have painted the cliffs, but what if he painted them in an act of revenge, a final, chilling portrait of his lover's last moments? We have our suspect, Phryne, Corbin said, his voice hard. Dominic Shaw. He killed her, staged the robbery, and ran. I shook my head, my eyes fixed on a small, insignificant detail on the floor. A single white petal, from a type of flower that only grew on the cliffs. It was a subtle, almost invisible clue. But something about it felt wrong. It was too easy. I have a feeling, detective, I said quietly, that Dominic Shaw is just another part of the lie. The murderer wants us to believe he is the killer. But I think he is just another victim. Chapter 3. Miles Corbin stood in the cabin, the journal of Dominic Shaw clutched in his hand. He was a man accustomed to facts, to evidence that could be seen and touched and documented. A journal filled with a man's hopes for a new life, a half-finished painting, and the absence of the writer himself. To him, it painted a clear picture. The narrative was simple: a jealous lover who murdered his rival and then fled. "It's an open and shut case, Miss Fisher," he said, his voice hard with conviction. "He fell for her, they planned to leave, she got cold feet, and he snapped." I shook my head, my eyes scanning the small cabin once more, looking for something that didn't fit, a piece of the puzzle that was a different shape entirely. "It's too simple, Detective." Lillian was a star, but she was not a simple woman. She would never have agreed to a clandestine meeting here without a good reason. She knew she was in danger. Why would she place herself in the path of a man who wrote so possessively about her? "Possessive men kill, Miss Fisher," he replied, his tone dismissive. "Possessive men also don't leave love letters lying around for the police to find," I shot back. "This isn't an open and shut case. It's a carefully crafted illusion. Dominic Shaw is the fall guy. He's either been killed himself, or he's been framed. And I intend to prove it." A deep sigh escaped him. "Look, I respect your intuition, but I have a job to do. I'm putting out a bulletin on Shaw." "You do that," I said, a challenge in my voice. "And while you're busy chasing a ghost, I'll be looking for the real killer, the one still lurking in the shadows of Seacliff House." I left him there, returning to the storm-swept mansion. The rain had started again, and the wind had picked up, a furious wail that seemed to carry with it the unspoken secrets of the house. I made my way to Lillian's bedroom, a luxurious space with silk curtains and an enormous four-poster bed. The room felt sterile, scrubbed clean of her vibrant personality. The police had been through it, of course, cataloguing every item, but I knew that the real clues were never in the obvious places. I ran my fingers over the objects on her vanity: a silver hairbrush, a bottle of expensive perfume, a small photograph of her and a man I didn't recognize, smiling on a beach. It was a picture of Julian, but a much younger, happier Julian than the one I had met. There was a faint scent in the air, a mix of her floral perfume and something else, something metallic and sharp. A scent I couldn't place. I moved on to the conservatory, a glass-walled room on the east side of the house that housed an array of exotic plants. It was a damp, humid space, and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and strange blossoms. The conservatory was Genevieve's domain. She had told me so herself, her voice almost tender as she described her love for the plants, the one thing in her life that she could control. I looked at the plants, their leaves a riot of greens and purples, and my eyes landed on a potted plant with delicate, pure white blossoms. A rare species from the Pacific Northwest, with petals that looked like tiny, unfurling handkerchiefs. The same petals I had seen on the ground at the cabin. A cold, certain feeling settled in my stomach. The petals had not been from the cliff. They had been from here, from a plant that Genevieve tended with meticulous care. It was a subtle, seemingly insignificant detail, but it was a deliberate one. The killer had left a breadcrumb trail, a clue to lead us to the secret lover, a clue that was designed to be found and misinterpreted. My next step was to find out more about Dominic Shaw. I knew the local police wouldn't be much help, but my connections in the city were vast and far-reaching. A quick phone call to a journalist friend in Seattle gave me the name of his sister, Beatrice Shaw, a librarian living in a small coastal town not far from here. I drove through the rain, the tires of my car hissing on the slick asphalt, my mind racing with new possibilities. Beatrice was a quiet, bookish woman with the same kind eyes as her brother. She invited me in, and over a cup of tea, she spoke of Dominic with a loving, quiet warmth. Dominic wasn't a violent man, Miss Fisher. He couldn't be. He was a pacifist. He was so gentle he used to apologize to the ants he accidentally stepped on. Her voice was soft but firm. He loved Lillian, yes, but he wouldn't have hurt a fly, let alone her. "Did he mention anything to you? Any plans to run away?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "He did. He called me 2 days ago, a few hours before it happened. He told me that he was going to meet Lillian. She had a plan, a way for them to be together without hurting anyone. She told him to meet her at the cabin, to wait for a signal. She had a grand plan to disappear with him, to start a new life away from the spotlight. My breath caught in my throat. Lillian hadn't been planning to leave Julian. She'd been planning to fake her own death. She was going to stage it, I whispered, the puzzle pieces clicking into place. She was an actress, after all. It was the perfect final performance. She would stage her death, and she and Dominic would slip away, undetected. He was so excited, Beatrice said, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. He said she told him to wait in the cabin. She was going to meet him there, and they would leave together. He was going to wait for a specific signal. She said she would send him a photo of herself, a final curtain call, and then he would know it was time to go. I thanked her, my mind now running in a new direction. The missing jewelry, the architectural plans for the cabin, even the empty wine glass, it all made sense now. It was all part of Lillian's plan. But someone had interrupted her performance. Someone had turned her staged death into a real one. The killer hadn't just murdered her. They had found out about her plan and turned it against her, using her own tricks to frame her lover. The crime was not a simple act of passion. It was a complex act of sabotage. I drove back to Seacliff House, the rage of the storm matching the fury in my own heart. I found Julian in the drawing room, staring into the flickering embers of the fire. Julian, I said, my voice low. Lillian was an actress, wasn't she? She was a master of illusion. She could make you believe anything. He turned, his eyes tired and haunted. What are you getting at, Phryne? The missing jewelry, Julian, I said, holding his gaze. She wasn't running away with another man. She was running away from you. She was going to fake her own death, and she was going to use those sentimental pieces of jewelry as a final clue, a breadcrumb trail that led to a life she could never have with you. His face paled, the color draining from it. You're mad, he whispered, shaking his head. Am I? I said, my voice rising just enough to carry over the wind. I know about Dominic Shaw, Julian. I know about the cabin and the plans. And I know about the final signal. The one she was going to send to him. A photograph. Did you see it? A photo of her, taken on the cliff, just before she was to fall. A final masterpiece of her own making. His eyes grew wide with terror, and he took a step back. He knew. He knew the plan, and he had sabotaged it. But before I could press him for more, the door to the drawing room flew open, and Mrs. Gable stood there, a strange, frantic look on her usually placid face. Miss Fisher, she said, her voice a gasp. It's Genevieve. She's gone. My heart hammered against my ribs. Julian wasn't the killer. I had been wrong about him. The killer was still in the house. And they had just claimed their second victim. Chapter 4. The frantic gasp from Mrs. Gable was a sound unlike any I had ever heard from her. It was a single, raw burst of fear that cut through the noise of the storm. She's gone, she had said, and I felt a cold dread settle over me. I raced after her, Julian on my heels, his face a new mask of terror. We found Genevieve in her private study, a room tucked away in the west wing of the house, where she wrote her plays. The room was locked from the inside. A locksmith was called, and when the door finally swung open with a soft click, the sight that met my eyes was both tragic and utterly staged. Genevieve sat slumped in her writing chair, a half-empty bottle of prescription pills on the table beside her, and a note clutched in her hand. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of old iron and the faint, sweet smell of almonds. It was a scene so perfectly constructed it felt more like a play than reality. Corbin arrived, his face grim, and immediately secured the room. He picked up the note, his eyes scanning the elegant, spidery handwriting. It's a suicide note, he announced, his voice flat with finality. A full confession. She admits to killing her sister, to faking the robbery. Says she couldn't live with the guilt. Julian looked at the scene, a look of profound shock on his face. "My God," he whispered. "She hated Lillian. I never thought she would do this." I watched Corbin, his expression a mixture of relief and weary acceptance. This was his neat and tidy conclusion. The case was solved. The public would be satisfied. The press would have their story. But my gut screamed that it was a lie, a final act of manipulation. "It's a murder, Miles," I said, my voice low and firm. He looked at me as though I had just spoken a different language. "Look at the scene, Phryne. The door was locked from the inside. The bottle is here, the note. The motive is clear. She was jealous, she snapped, and now she's taken her own life. It's over." "It's not over," I said, my gaze sweeping the room. "And the door isn't the problem. The will is." "What will?" he asked, a crease of annoyance appearing between his brows. Just then, a uniformed officer came in, a manila envelope in his hand. "Detective, we found this in the safe in the study. It's a new will, signed by Miss Thorne last week. It leaves everything, the entire estate, to her sister, Genevieve." Corbin's face went white. The narrative he had so carefully constructed crumbled before his eyes. A will giving Genevieve a fortune and a suicide note confessing to murder? The timing was too perfect. This wasn't a confession. It was a frame. I turned my attention to the note clutched in Genevieve's hand. "Look at it closely, Miles," I said. "The ink is too fresh. The handwriting, while a good mimicry of her hand, is too careful, too precise." Genevieve's writing was frantic, filled with a nervous energy that is absent from this note. A person in the throes of a suicidal breakdown would not write a perfectly legible, evenly spaced confession. He took the note from the officer and examined it. The skepticism in his eyes slowly faded, replaced by a dawning horror. I was right. The note was a forgery, and the body was a piece of evidence. "And the lock?" I asked, looking at the door. "Show me the lock." The locksmith, a quiet, older man, showed us the simple latch and bolt. "I don't know how they did it, detective. But it was locked from the inside, a dead bolt." I examined the door frame. My fingers, a lifetime of practice at picking locks, immediately felt for a subtle change, a minute imperfection. A sliver of wood near the top of the frame was splintered, a tiny, almost invisible mark. I pushed my finger against it, and a small, nearly imperceptible wire slid out of a tiny drilled hole, disappearing into the wall. It was a thread and wire trick, a classic illusionist's method. A string tied to a screw on the inside of the bolt, with the wire pulling it from the outside just enough to make it seem like a locked room, then retracting it back into the frame. A simple, clever trick. A playwright's trick. A mind that thinks in terms of stagecraft, in terms of illusion and deception. "The killer didn't just murder Genevieve, Miles," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "They killed her and then meticulously staged her death to look like a suicide. They wanted to make it look like she killed Lillian and then killed herself. They wanted to make us believe that the case was closed." Corbin looked at me, a profound look of disbelief and respect in his eyes. He had a case with 2 murders, a falsified will, a forged note, and a staged suicide. The simple solution had been proven wrong. "But if it wasn't Genevieve, then who?" he asked. "Who had the motive, the mind for this kind of elaborate theatrical performance?" I looked at the forged note in his hand. The handwriting was a near-perfect mimicry of Genevieve's, but the flow of the words, the structure of the sentences, it was too elegant, too refined. It was not a playwright's hand. It was an artist's. A man who understood composition and form, who could make a lie look like the truth. I looked at Julian Vance, who stood in the doorway, his face pale and sick. I had been so focused on his performative grief, on the subtle clues that he was hiding something, that I had missed the most obvious clue of all. He was a painter. He understood illusion, and he understood the art of hiding things in plain sight. The second death, the staged suicide, was not an act of desperation. It was a message. A brutal warning. The killer was tying up all the loose ends, making sure that there would be no more questions, no more witnesses. They had killed Lillian to stop her from leaving, and they had killed Genevieve because she knew about the plan and was a threat to his freedom. I walked over to Julian, my eyes fixed on his. You staged it, didn't you, Julian? You faked the note. You knew about the old stage magic tricks to make the room seem locked from the inside. You are a painter, after all, an artist who understands how to make a thing look like it's something else. He took a step back, his eyes darting to the door. You're wrong, Phryne. It's a mad accusation. Is it? I said, my voice cold. I have a feeling you're not the only one in this house who has a talent for dramatic performance. Now, there are only 3 of us left. You, me, and Mrs. Gable. Corbin moved to block the doorway. The wind howled outside, and the house felt small and terribly dangerous. The game was no longer afoot. The game was now personal, and it was about to come to its final, devastating conclusion. Chapter 5. The wind had not relented. It was a furious, howling ghost battering the windows, and in the silence that followed my accusation, it seemed to be the only thing that dared to breathe. Julian stood frozen, his face a landscape of shock and dawning terror. Detective Corbin, his hand on the hilt of his weapon, was poised and ready, his eyes darting between us. That's a baseless accusation, Miss Fisher, Julian finally managed to say, his voice thin and shaky. I was with you when Mrs. Gable found her. And you are a master of illusion, aren't you, Julian? I said, my voice cutting through the tense air. An artist who knows how to make a lie look like a truth. You made us all believe you were a grieving fiancé, but in reality, you were a desperate man losing everything. Just then, the lights flickered and died, plunging the room into a deep, consuming darkness. A gasp escaped Mrs. Gable's lips. I heard the scrape of a match, and a moment later, a candelabra was lit on the table, casting long, dancing shadows that made the room feel as though it were alive. The flickering flames illuminated our faces, a silent audience to the final act of this terrible play. I believe you owe us an explanation, Miss Fisher, Corbin said, his voice a low rumble. Julian's motive wasn't just jealousy, I began, my eyes fixed on the man now bathed in the candlelight's ghostly glow. It was desperation. He wasn't a charming artist in love. He was a man who had built his career, his very life, on Lillian's fame and fortune. Her plan to fake her death wasn't just a theatrical escape. It was a direct threat to his carefully constructed life. I took a step closer, my shadow lengthening on the wall behind me. Lillian was a genius at her craft. She planned to stage her death on the cliffs, a dramatic fall from the world, and then slip away to a new life with Dominic Shaw. The missing jewelry wasn't a motive for a robbery. It was a final clue, a breadcrumb trail meant to throw everyone off her scent. Julian shook his head frantically. No, that's insane. I knew nothing of a plan. You knew everything, I countered, my voice unwavering. That's why you killed her. You met her on the cliff, knowing her plan, and you seized the moment. You didn't push her to fake her death. You pushed her to her death. You made sure her performance was a final, fatal one. You then planted the stolen jewelry and architectural plans in Dominic's cabin, knowing that a lovelorn artist would be the perfect fall guy. A chilling silence filled the room. Julian's bravado had evaporated, replaced by a deep, shivering fear. He looked at Corbin, but the detective's eyes were on me, watching, listening, trusting me now with a faith that went beyond reason. And then there's Genevieve, I continued, my voice now a low whisper. She was a playwright, a master of plot and subtext. She saw the truth of her sister's life, and she saw the truth in her sister's death. She must have confronted you, Julian, armed with her own set of subtle clues. She knew the truth about Lillian's plan, and she knew you had sabotaged it. I walked to the door of the study, now standing in the corner of the room. So you killed her, too. But this time, you had to be more creative. You had to make sure there were no more loose ends. You staged her death to look like a suicide, a final confession that would tie up both murders in a neat, tidy bow. Julian's face was ashen. He was cornered, his artistic mask finally slipping. You used her own talents against her, I said. The locked room trick, for example. It was a simple, clever illusion, a stage trick that a professional artist would know. And the note. The note was the work of a forger. You mimicked her handwriting, but you missed a detail only an artist would know. The weight of the hand on the paper, the small flourishes on the capitals, all too perfect, too composed. A woman confessing to murder would have a frantic hand, a messy script. This note was too elegant, Julian. Too well painted. A sob escaped Julian's lips, a ragged, broken sound. He finally broke. The weight of his guilt was a tangible thing, a suffocating force in the small, candlelit room. And you left a witness, I said, turning to the silent figure of Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable. You were in the kitchen, weren't you? You must have seen something. The white petals on the floor of the cabin. They were a subtle clue, a misdirection to the wrong suspect. But you knew where those petals came from, didn't you? They were from Genevieve's prized conservatory. Mrs. Gable nodded, her face a mask of sorrow. Yes, miss. I saw him. He was in the conservatory, pulling the petals from the flowers. I thought he was just admiring them. I had no idea. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Julian had planned every detail, every misdirection, right down to the last petal. The rage that had been a silent companion for days now erupted. Julian lunged for the door, his eyes wild with desperation. But Corbin was faster. He moved with a speed and grace that belied his size, his arms snaking out and tackling Julian to the ground. The clatter of the candlestick falling was the only sound in the room, and then the final, horrible silence as Julian was subdued. The storm outside finally began to wane, the wind softening to a low moan, the rain turning to a soft drizzle. The candles flickered but held, casting a final, victorious light on the man now being handcuffed. The grand performance was over, the stage empty save for the quiet reality of a killer caught. I looked at Julian, at the charming painter who had let his greed and desperation turn him into a monster. He was no longer the elegant artist. He was just a man, his face stripped bare of all pretense. Corbin stood up, his gaze on me, a look of profound respect and admiration in his eyes. He didn't need to say a word. I knew. The case was closed, the truth revealed. But a quiet, tense feeling still lingered in the air, a different kind of tension now, a quiet promise of something more. Chapter 6. The storm had finally broken. The air, once thick with the fury of the wind and rain, now felt clean and still, smelling of sea salt and wet stone. A pale, exhausted moon broke through the clouds, casting a silver light over the moors and illuminating the dark expanse of the ocean. Julian Vance had been taken away, his silence a final, cold confession. The house, once a stage for a terrible drama, now felt like an empty theater. I stood on the cliff walk, the wind now a gentle whisper against my cheeks. The sea had calmed, its waves a soft lullaby against the rocks below. The tragedy of Lillian and Genevieve felt distant now, a sad and quiet memory. I had done what I came here to do. I had unmasked a killer, not for justice or glory, but for a friend. A wave of profound weariness washed over me, a bone-deep exhaustion that only comes after a great deal of emotional and physical exertion. A footstep behind me alerted me to his presence. Miles Corbin walked towards me, his long trench coat billowing in the breeze. He stopped beside me, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. We simply stood there, two souls who had just navigated a terrible darkness and found a way out. He was a man of logic, a man of facts, and I was a woman of intuition, a creature of the heart, but in the end, we had solved it together. You were right, he said, his voice a low rumble. About all of it. The note, the trick lock, Julian Vance. You saw what I couldn't. It's not a matter of who sees what, I said, looking out at the endless horizon. It's a matter of knowing where to look. You were looking at the facts. I was looking at the story. The truth was there, in plain sight, hidden in the shadows of a grand performance. He nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. I've never worked with anyone like you before, Miss Fisher. You're an unsettling presence. A small, genuine smile touched my lips. I take that as a compliment, Detective. Your job is to deal with the facts. Mine is to deal with the humans behind them. Sometimes, the humans are far more complicated than any crime. We fell back into a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between two people who have been through something terrible together. I felt a new kind of tension between us now, not the friction of two opposing forces, but the pull of two kindred spirits who had found each other in the dark. It was a subtle, unspoken current, and it was far more dangerous than any killer. He turned to me, his eyes searching mine in the moonlight. So, what happens now, Phryne? The case is closed. Julian is being processed. The truth will be in the morning papers. And then, you'll be gone. That is the nature of my work, Detective. I come when I'm needed, and I leave when I'm not. But what if you're still needed? He asked, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze dropping to my lips. I didn't answer. The air between us was electric, and a part of me, the part one kept well guarded, wanted to lean into him, to feel the solid warmth of his presence. I had spent my life seeking adventure, running from the comfort and predictability that others craved. But standing here with him, on the edge of the world, I felt a quiet, powerful urge to stay. He reached out and gently cupped my face, his thumb stroking my cheek. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, that it took my breath away. He was not a man of grand gestures or eloquent speeches. He was a man of quiet, powerful actions, and this was an action that spoke volumes. Thank you, Phryne, he said, his voice husky. Thank you for not giving up, for seeing what I couldn't. And then, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a passionate, demanding kiss, but a stolen one, a soft press of his lips against mine that held all the unsaid things between us. It was a promise, a question, a goodbye, and a hello all at once. The moment was fleeting, a perfect slice of time against the backdrop of the roaring sea, and then it was over. He pulled back, his eyes still locked with mine, and I saw a flicker of something new there, something vulnerable and hopeful. Goodbye, Phryne Fisher, he said, his voice just a low murmur. I have a feeling our paths will cross again. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I simply turned and walked back toward the house, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. The case was closed, the darkness had been pushed back, and the shadows at Seacliff House had finally been laid to rest. But as I walked, I knew that a new adventure had just begun, and its name was Miles Corbin. That concludes Shadows at Seacliff House. I hope you enjoyed this journey into the dramatic and dangerous world of Phryne Fisher and Detective Miles Corbin. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, imagine what else we can create together. Don't miss the next chapter of our storytelling adventure. Subscribe to my channel for more exclusive content, plot twists, and romance that will leave you breathless.